Welcome to the Infinite Improvisation Podcast, Adventures in Music and Creativity. I'm Steve Treseler, joined by Lauren Best, and in this final episode of our pilot season, we'll give you a taste of some things to come in future seasons. So far, pilot episodes have been some open discussions about, the who, what, and why of the podcast, but we're going to get into some other experiments and segments.
Which I am very excited about.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have some surprises planned for each other, which we haven't even totally explained to each other yet.
Kind of a reaction, a reveal video, and just see how that goes. That's one of our segments or themes coming up. And also we've talked about some musical experiments, like performing or other artistic experiments, documenting the process. I mean, one will be, I think next season, we're going to document the process of collaboratively writing a theme song for the podcast.
Yeah, so because interestingly, we have talked about music a lot, but we have not actually made any music together.
Yeah.
I think that's true. We've done zero musical collaborations, so we are planning on showing what that's like, which is also a first. Not only the first time collaborating together, but I think that'd be the first time for me documenting the process on a podcast.
Exactly. So we'll have some other musical, live musical experiments, and not even necessarily like demonstrating or tips and tricks or anything like that, but here's like the process of doing it and putting ourselves in artistically risky situations live, and we'll see. Yeah, we'll see how that all works out. It sounds exciting.
And a little nerve-wracking, but I think that's part of you and I both. If you've been listening so far, you know that Steve and I think about formats and structures and kind of the container aspect as well as modeling. So I'm looking forward to playing a little bit with the format of how collaboration looks and how podcasting looks for us.
Yeah. And since it's a podcast, we're going to have guests, so we'll have some interviews and discussions with people who are doing, artists and educators who are doing awesome things.
Which is exciting. It's great to be able to invite people to the party.
Absolutely. And also we want to do some Q&A, some Ask Us Anything, and inviting listeners and you to submit your questions for us. So you can find us online or go to infiniteimprovisation.com and submit a question for us, and we would love to hear from you. So we've got a couple questions from listeners, or should we say future listeners, because we're going to publish this whole pilot season at once. So we have enthusiastic future listeners who haven't heard a show yet, but sent us questions anyway.
We've been telling them about what the process has been like so far, and luckily they were wondering. Yeah.
So I got a great one from our friend Melissa. Melissa Slocum. She is a piano teacher in the Atlanta area and a host of the Sounds of Encouragement podcast. So any music teachers, you'll definitely want to check that out. So she has a question for us about her practice, and Lauren hasn't heard this yet, so I'm surprising Lauren with this question.
A little bit of backstory is I have two boys who are transfer students who started in Faber, and they're 6 and 8 years old, and they had a very traditional teaching setup with their former teacher. I suspect, although no one has said it, that basically improvisation was sort of not forbidden, but really frowned upon as not making music by their former teacher. And the mom also, I know at home, tries to not have them do anything around the piano unless it's music, because she doesn't want them banging, I don't think, on the piano at home. And maybe the most basic question and how that should be framed for a show is, when the usual approaches to improvisation do not seem to be working, and there is still just reticence about doing improvisation at all, should a teacher who's, well-equipped, well-experienced, back off and not push? Or should a teacher try something maybe out of the ordinary? And if the answer is the latter, what are some of the out of the ordinary approaches that one might try when you feel like you've done all the other approaches and tried some of the other more common techniques for beginning improvisation, whether it's rhythm and sound or exploration or animals or drawing pictures or copycat or whatever.
Okay.
Cool.
Well, thanks, Melissa. Yeah, a lot there. I mean, this is certainly working with kids of that age. That's certainly your wheelhouse. Even what jumps out at me, like, what are the usual approaches or not?
Yeah.
That's a big thing to unpack. But what are your first thoughts on that? I know you work with a lot of kids in that age range. I believe she said, may have not said this, 6 and 8 or somewhere in that age range.
Mm-hmm. And I had a similar question or thought in response. And I've used Faber myself. So there's also some improvisation and creativity suggested within the method book. So I wondered if what she described as the usual approaches, we're using some of those. And I say that because like they're written down, so it's easy for a parent to see and understand and sort of suggest.
Yeah. And she had also told me that they did things like doing some call and response. Here, I play this, you copy it, and now you change one note about it. And then they would freeze and just not, as soon as they were making a creative decision, was just not, they were very resistant to that. So and she said, mentioned things like drawing pictures or let's, play an emotion. Let's express an emotion. She was giving me a few of the ideas that she had tried, and they were just not having it.
And I mean, I always suggest with kids repeating and seeing what happens again, because sometimes repeating the same activity can have a different result because they're used to it this time. They have a feeling of safety and they know what to anticipate. So where you get nothing at first, sometimes I find trying again and sometimes again after that sometimes we want to change approaches, of course, but sometimes waiting a little longer and having repeated exposure, I find can help. One, because different days are different, and a child might be hungry or have wet socks or have not slept well or whatever on one day. And so they're going to have their attention is less, their emotional state is different. They're not, they're distracted by their socks. They're not as ready to take risks, and it might just be different on a different day. That being said, sometimes we do want to just change the approach. Right away when she was talking, I mean, I like to work with parents and talk about how we can set things up a little differently and change the approach maybe so that there isn't pressure around practicing, for example, and so that there's a little more understanding around, say, you can spend time at the piano doing things that is more exploratory. And there will be some banging, but working with what's within the range of it's not going to damage the instrument. It's, maybe there are limits on it. So it's not when mom's trying to talk to you, but that the banging, as long as it's not using a hammer or scissors, might be okay. And trying to work up the family culture and tolerance around that, because kids do explore in ways that are way too much. Kids will put their feet on the piano, and you do need to kind of decide whether you're going to say no or encourage that. So I think working with the family environment too. I'll pause. What do you think so far based on what I've said?
I loved your answer. Yeah, and what jumped out is a lot of those ideas you have, and those certainly can work. It's often how it's presented. And what jumped up, if you're teaching the brothers, I don't know if you've tried teaching them together, but I find some of this stuff works so great when you have a group and they're playing off each other instead of just an adult trying to draw something out of the kid. My daughter started this program when she was 4. It's called Creative Music Adventures, almost like our tagline. It was a group piano lesson with 4-year-olds, and her buddies were in it. And they were, so the group thing, but also not saying now we're going to create or we're going to compose something, making this game element kind of work throughout, even as you're doing skill development. They had this game called Island. You can find some of this at Musical Monsters, and there's some training things for it. But there's not going to be like a secret method that will work. It's setting up the right environment. So for instance, they had a game called Island. So every time they would play a repetition correctly, they would tell the teacher what animal to draw on the whiteboard on this island. Now we want a flamingo, and they'd draw it. Then they would play again. Now we're going to draw another animal. And this was through the reps and skill development. But then it could switch to, now we're going to play a song about the flamingo or something like that. So the kind of the playfulness and the game and the creativity can be embedded throughout the whole lesson. I mean, I even remember, I know Melissa had brought up animals. I mean, her very first lesson at the piano was they were just down on the bass range. Here's where the bears live, and they're all just kind of banging in the bear range, then going up to, like bass clef range. Here's where the dogs live in the piano, and then the cats up here in the treble, and then the little Tweety birds. And so right away we're playing like bears and birds, and there's elements of, I mean, that's improvising animals and making little games and activities. And that's not everyone's teaching style to necessarily make it that, turning about cartoon animals, but you're doing it in a group, and it's embedded throughout the whole experience, and it will feel less weird. And suddenly we've been reading music, and now suddenly you play your own note. I'm like, whoa, wait a second. This is different.
And sometimes we can build off that. So we kind of sneak it in. Because I find sometimes this still happens to me, right? Where I'm like, just try this. And then it's like crickets, and I think I've proposed something fun, accessible, easy. Like, I didn't think it was that big of an ask. And what I met with is like, oh, okay, I need to adjust that. And sometimes following threads that wouldn't normally be what I would do, like some of those more symbolic ideas, and then modeling some of what making stuff up means. Because sometimes when you say, come up with something, the student is imagining something far longer, far more complex, far like more denser, like more notes happening. They're thinking they need to do a lot. And we're thinking, oh, you just play something very slow and simple, and I'd love that, or you just play one note, please, I'd love it, And I often use the example from early childhood classes that I can't tell you how many times I have heard people say to me, my child never sings when we're here. And sometimes that means they just like seem quiet. Sometimes it means like they sit there doing nothing, looking around. Sometimes it means they don't sing, but they're kind of into it. Sometimes it means they cried at the beginning of the first 3 classes and like they weren't sure if they were going to stay. But I hear variations of this. My child doesn't sing while we're here. But then when we get in the stroller, they're singing the songs all the way home. But then they were singing the songs when they woke up the other day, and it's actually really getting in there. And I've seen kids who appear to be like not participating, like they're very much just observing, which I'm cool with. But sometimes grown-ups want to get everyone involved. And then one day, out of nowhere, they've absorbed what they feel they want to absorb, and they are right there, fully participating. And sometimes that can be a slow transition. Sometimes if we just stay patient with it, it's a quick transition. So when you're talking about the bears, I imagine things like, if I was following that thread, I might do something like, I might start playing like bear footsteps, right? And start to do some beat keeping with low sounds of bear footsteps on black keys. Then maybe I can give the student the job. And maybe even though they won't make things up, maybe they can play some footsteps and just feel that. And then if I start playing some really slow or textural, there's lots of options for what I play with that. But then they're seeing what I would do with that. So then whether it's that time or another time, maybe in the future we'd be able to switch. And maybe if I'm playing the bear footsteps, maybe they can imagine clapping along to that to try to, can you make noise to try to scare the bear away? Just make a bunch of noise. Maybe they can imagine what it'd be like to add birds to the bear sounds. Maybe I play, those bear footsteps and I say, just pick one black key at a time to play along with the bear, just to go along with it. Just play one at a time, hold it for as long as you want and switch, which maybe that would be too much for those students. Yeah. But all those things I described could be like scaled down to be easier. It doesn't have to go that whole process all at once, but kind of if it's not working, how can we make it even easier and then slowly build on that?
Yeah. And if these kids are just very comfortable with reading it off the page, you can start there. Some kids are the opposite. Or if you write something down about it, it induces more anxiety. So it could be even, okay, here's the song you're working on. Now, how would a mouse play this song? Or maybe how would a bear play this? So they're still reading it, but interpreting it differently and kind of using more notation as a gateway as soon as you give them an open choice, if that's what's causing them to shut down. So we're kind of, you have to tailor the experience for who it is. But I'm a big fan of sneaking it in and not making it suddenly it's creative time and now you're going to do something different from what you're used to. But yeah, I've been doing a lot of these workshops and one-on-one, and I like to think of myself as being, making the experience more disarming and inviting. But boy, just last week I was teaching an online lesson with someone doing some of the call and response. Now we're just going to change the last note, some of my, my tricks. And this girl is a well, she's a skilled player and, performing and doing all this, but just one of these things, as soon as she knew that, now it's, she just, completely froze, deer in the headlights, and started crying and broke down during the lesson. And then okay, we stopped, and then, we paused and we went on to something else. Then she wrote me this letter, apologizing for crying during the lesson, that she froze up in jazz band the day before too, or something. It's just hard, so we'll go through it. But, as much as I'm doing this, I feel like I can get people to feel comfortable doing it. One of my last lessons was a kid crying doing it. So it's, and she's, very confident. A lot of the other, it's like, there's a lot of big feelings involved with this. So there's not even what I think is my go-to trick that always works, didn't work this time. Or if she had a group of friends doing it, then they do it together and it may have been okay. It's
yeah. And sometimes it's about establishing some of the serve and return, or the idea of two voices, instead of focusing on the creative aspect of it, in terms of let's generate something, right? It just being play with one hand, play with the other hand. And maybe that's two notes that they've determined in advance, but they're having a feeling of back and forth, right? And then it's okay, if one hand plays a secret code, could the other hand echo that? That's something my son loved to do. I tried to teach him stuff at the piano, and at the time it was, it wasn't going super well, but he loved the activity where we would knock a secret code on the wall, not on the piano.
Wow.
Because here I am being I've taught so many kids, he's going to love exploring the piano, and he wanted to just knock rhythms back and forth on the wall just to echo each other, and sometimes kids prefer to be the leader, prefer to be the follower. Sometimes we're not even echoing anymore. We're just going back and forth with stuff. And then, that was able to eventually transfer to the piano. But the making things more open-ended, as you're saying, can be challenging. We don't always know what people are arriving with that day, right? And it's really, music is really stimulating to our brains. And that can feel like confusion at sometimes. And that can feel overwhelming at times. And so... it's like you and I know what it's like to forget a part and to go blank on something and to have to figure out what happens. But kids who haven't had that experience feel shocked and dismayed and, maybe some other feelings when they suddenly blank because they haven't had that experience yet.
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely. And maybe these students would they'd feel more in control if they could prepare something a little bit too. What Lauren, you were talking about last time, the musical Mad Libs. You might give them some music with a couple notes missing, and then they have to fill in their own notes, but they can work on it home and then bring it back and play. Here's what I prepared. Something like that might work. Or my daughter's piano teacher had design your own instrument and see how it works. So she would hit this beam over here by the Girl Scout, because she hit her flip flop against that support beam in the house, and it shook the whole house and made the coolest sound ever. And then we were at the park, and she's finding, this is an instrument. It's just different with different kids. So I hope that's helpful. But I'm sure a lot of the material you were working with could work just fine. It's just how it's so much, in our previous episode, we're talking about, is not necessarily the material or the content. It's just the atmosphere or the culture, how it's introduced. And
build on what does work. And as I was saying, sometimes you can take what does work, even if that is, there's a song they're feeling good about, 2 notes out of that song, their best moment in that song can become the ostinato. And then maybe you model some very, very simple improv with that, so that they see possibilities, even if they aren't quite ready to go there yet themselves, that they see what that could be.
Yeah.
And just slowing things down, sometimes just waiting longer for responses, or like I said, repeating it, but sometimes literally just waiting, just silently like, asking a question and just silently waiting for the response, or giving them some time to try things. I find sometimes I worry that something's not successful. When you're used to working with groups too, you don't want like a dead air. You don't want to lose the kids. But at the same time, I find kids sometimes need just a little extra time to process things, because their brains are not moving quite in the same way as ours, and their experience isn't quite the same. So sometimes I find it's holding that space for them, even if it doesn't feel successful or effective to us, because we're not seeing the instant result, but giving a little extra space to figure that out, I find.
Yeah. But it's awesome you're doing this and making this a cornerstone of your studio to make this happen. But whether or not, stick with it or abandon it is kind of, it's as we figure out how to embed it into the whole process, it's not an all or nothing kind of thing.
And also 6 and 8 is pretty young. And Melissa, I know you're very experienced. I'll speak directly to the question asker. Yeah. I know for myself, though, I need to remind myself that of some of the incredible changes I've seen in students who approach challenges in certain ways when they're 6 or when they're 7. And by the time they're 8 or 10, it's a whole different ball game, And so sometimes I'm sure most teachers and coaches have had these kinds of experiences, but I think sometimes it's bringing our minds back to how much things can change for a kid over time, and that sometimes, as you were saying, it's meeting them where they're at, and then it's not going to be this lesson or next lesson necessarily that we turn the corner, so to speak, but next year it's going to be a whole different scenario.
But yeah, but I also really like what you said about bringing the parents on board for the journey and having that conversation, and the boundaries, how much knocking on the lid is okay, preparing the piano in certain ways are okay, but not damaging the instrument, and figuring out how to have it be a family process too.
And maybe that'll be a whole episode, the bounds of free play.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I'm so glad we got that question. What a wonderful thing to talk about.
Thank you. And yes, we welcome your questions, text questions, or we love hearing your voice too. So those audio questions are awesome. Okay, and we have another question from your fellow Canadian, James Hurley, who is now running a piano studio with his wife in Bavaria, Germany, which sounds pretty awesome. But he has a question about teaching and sharing. He says, do you get your students bouncing their own improvisation recordings off each other?
Do you want to start with the answer for this?
Yeah. So in my case, I like having students bounce ideas off each other all the time, especially in what I'm doing in-person workshops, a lot of call and response back and forth, some musical conversations, or in other contexts, having one student start some kind of improvised idea and having a whole section of people copy it and turn it into one texture, all kinds of ways that they can bounce it off in person. But doing recordings, I had luck with that. I think it was something we talked about before when I was teaching a college improvisation class online, where we used a cloud-based digital audio workstation, and someone started with a track. It's like a 1 or 2 minute track, and then the next person at some point logged in and added something to it. So various people would add different layers or grooves, and some would add more sound effects or textural things, and they were a group project. And that turned out really cool. But even for my private studio, I've had a fizzled out attempt of doing some ambitious group composition project that didn't quite take off. And some of my students, we can work on getting them to be more skilled at recording themselves, and it's definitely some opportunity there. But for some of my private lessons, I haven't done that very much with recordings.
Mm-hmm. Although you mentioned doing a virtual recital, right?
Yeah. And that was for that recital, took the advice of our friend Stephen Hughes, who's been teaching online for years and years, to do it. Have students pre-record their pieces. So some got into some video and audio editing, but in that it was just like one video, and I stuck them all together. So there was less interaction between them in that recital.
Like in terms of the bouncing off of each other.
Yeah.
But some of what they were sharing was improvised, though?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And there was, I've done I did a virtual recital where everyone wrote something original. So then everyone was listening to each other. So some were writing things that sounded like standard jazz tunes, and other were text setting poems, and others were producing something in some electroacoustic things, and some students were playing over drones or doing solo improvisation. So in that way, we put the program together where it was a continuous program. So I hadn't really thought about it like that, but those weren't,
I guess less conversational. Yeah.
But certainly some of them, were inspired by, it was so cool what that student did for this. And that was one of the few silver linings of the pandemic, is actually getting those set up. I'm going to keep the, teaching. I have mixed feelings about teaching the lessons online. Some things work really well, but that format for the recital was really great, because then their family could tune in from around the world and they could share it, and we could do even a little more production element that just a different. And some kids really thrive doing that, where they weren't necessarily on stage with the lights, and they got to try it a few times. So some students really enjoyed the recording process. So still more opportunities, but I know there would be it's going to give me some more ideas. But how about you? Well, I know you've a lot of your students. You've got a lot of preschoolers. So how does this?
Well, I have some preschoolers and some school age kids. I found he specified recordings, and so I found that interesting, because my answer was going to be, and that's what I wanted you to answer first, is because I do group online piano lessons, where in each session we have, I like to ensure that we're doing creative and collaborative things every time, as well as individually like focused things where the students are working on their own kind of journey a little more privately. But part of the format of the lessons is that they're bouncing off those ideas, or sometimes it's not so much in the moment. Like, I would refer to it as bouncing ideas off of each other, or bouncing recordings off of each other. But as you were kind of describing, they're hearing each other improvise, often in really little bits. And sometimes that's because they're doing an activity together where they're going back and forth, and they're having that kind of musical conversation. Sometimes they're sharing something that they improvised while we were doing a different kind of activity, and they came up with more on their own, and then they want to share that with the group. So I haven't done that with recordings as much.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because I read the question and then thought about it throughout the day, and I forgot recordings was in there. So I was thinking about all the ways of doing it live. Or maybe he means bouncing off in a different way. Bounce, do they share their recordings? I improvise something and like playing it for other students, and he could have meant it that way.
Yeah, like what do you think of this kind of thing, And what I have found, I could do it with recordings. I've just found that often, for a bunch of reasons, it ends up being live in the lesson. But I do find that the feedback from other students is often, I just love some of those moments where one student gives another student just really heartfelt feedback, and they're like, wow, I thought that was really awesome. And that was just a really cool song. And like, for a student to say that to another student is a different kind of impact than if I say that. When you mention recordings, one of the things I thought of is that I like my students to be doing this in all kinds of tiny ways before we're thinking of like larger, longer recordings, like so that they're giving each other feedback on small moments. They're just giving feedback about their experience in something that was an ensemble activity. Like, they're getting used to noticing and giving feedback for themselves and for other people in a lot of micro moments, as opposed to necessarily like, here's this like chunk of improv I did. Can I have some feedback? Because for younger students, that's a lot. Like, that's a lot of musical information for them to process, as opposed to really, really short snippets, and often live, but they could be recorded. I encourage students to record themselves for themselves, to give themselves that kind of feedback. And in those short snippets, like really getting into the different aspects of what we notice, or what it reminds us of, what it brings up for us. Actually, I did an activity where the students started describing, like, as if the music was creating a soundtrack, and they were going into these really vivid visualizations based on what the music reminded them of. And there can be some really cool outcomes when you give them the chance to just kind of explore the aesthetic.
Wow. and that reminded me of an activity I've done that's like graphic score telephone, where you have like a group. I did this actually live with a group of, professional improvisers, I guess, where you had someone with, draw a bunch of symbols or pictures or something for us to use as a score and interpret that. So we performed it, and someone else who hadn't seen the score was listening to it and then drew a new picture based on what we were playing. And then we would perform that, and someone else would draw. Then we had this like gallery of all these, and you could, and it was
cool.
That was a wild experiment. That was
fun.
And go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say sometimes I kind of another graphic score variation is sometimes when we're working with some kind of graphic score. Sometimes we call them maps for the kids, and we actually get really into like visualizing landscapes and nature soundscapes, or sometimes it is more of like the graphic score kind of for like, sometimes we play with what that means and what we're going to explore with it in the first place. But sometimes it's that we're all exploring things muted, and the kids are coming up with really different ideas and exploring different concepts themselves in terms of contrasting voices, and then we're comparing that afterwards. Just the go away and then compare.
That's awesome. And one thing you said about the students giving each other feedback. One thing I do like, whether it's in person or even in the Zoom waiting room, where I have, when the students are overlapping, someone's coming to set up for their lesson, then you have someone else play. Oh, here's something this kid's working on. They play it for each other, and it's cute. Sometimes I have like an older student who's like working on some, like transcribing like something from a video game soundtrack, and they're playing it for this little kid. It's like, oh wow, that is so amazing. And they do it. Yeah. And doing that online, letting someone into the meeting early, and just even getting that little feedback, bouncing ideas off in that way. But as you said, it can be more meaningful coming from a peer rather than.
Well, and that's part of the reason I have the groups, is to give them more opportunities to get feedback from their peers, not just from me, but also more opportunities to feel that sharing feeling and that performance feeling and that, that risk taking of sharing. And also in a multi-level group, right, seeing kids to be, to that whose skill might be aspirational, or whose ideas might be aspirational, or who just might be approaching things differently, to see other people's learning journeys and see how, like, to feel that they can relate to that, and to also see that other people might have struggles. And sometimes I'll say to a student, like particularly an older student, say, hey, before you share that, why don't you describe a bit about what's going on for you in the learning process? Or like, do you mind mentioning to the other students that you're only playing half the song because that's the chunk you're looking at right now? Like, just asking them to name specifics to kind of show the younger students or the other students part of their process. And I also make it very optional to share. I don't coerce or bully, of course, but sometimes that can be like I don't, try to lean on kids to get them to play and share, because I find they want to eventually. Sometimes they don't want to that day. But that getting that feedback, I want them to really choose that and want that and consent to that, and not feel pushed into the sharing.
Absolutely. But the more they get comfortable with sharing, and even informal performances, it can really help just being more comfortable performing in general, because I have some students that only will sometimes play by themselves if it's like an adjudication or an audition, and then the performance thing becomes a really high stakes thing. So as much as there can be that informal sharing, even if I do have a kid who's getting ready for an audition or a solo contest, our favorite thing, but they're like getting ready for that and they're going to be pushed into it, I will even bring out my kid and have her bring, like when she's little, she'd bring the pet and like a stuffy or something, and here's your audience. And suddenly even going from nothing to just one little kid, it was like, oh, and suddenly they kind, it was a way to actually practice and it was actually a bigger jump going from nothing to a 5-year-old and a stuffed animal versus going from the one person to an adjudicator the next week. But just making that comfort as much as people can casually, share with their families or their communities and all of that. This is more than James bargained for, probably. One other idea I had to do with my students that I never, it's just bringing back this idea that fizzled out and I nearly forgot about, but having some kind of collaborative composition project where we might have each student on their own time record some piece of it, and there could be some limitation, whether it's a pitch limitation or something about mood, and then have all of these as like samples or loops, and then one of the more sophisticated kids take all of these samples that were recorded and then shape them into a couple students shape it into like using those as sounds and samples and stick the whole thing together, which would be pretty fun. I should do that.
Yeah. I was thinking about a music version of like the 1 second video things where, I think there's an app or something, 1 second every day. And it's a whole bunch of 1 second videos put together. And I was thinking, what if I had each of the students, only have a short little bit and string that together, which is something we already kind of do in lessons, but pre-recorded, it would be a bit different. And maybe not 1 second, maybe 5 seconds, but just to riff on what you were saying, like the idea of samples or loops or layering, but also the idea of like stringing together. I think you've called it a ribbon before. Sometimes I imagine it like a string of beads.
Yeah, absolutely. So ways to, as we were talking before about improvisation being here in the moment in this room, but then what's the asynchronous way of making some of these connections and interactions, but using technology, warping the space-time continuum a bit. And some of those projects can be more effective when we're using technology as opposed to giving everyone on a conference call. And although that was something I was experimenting with during the pandemic, having everyone with headphones and doing live improvisations and just building the latency as a creative limitation. Exactly. That's another topic. But
and another quick thing about recording specifically that I think about and asynchronous ways of working is just questions of like accessibility and equity, and that can be sometimes working asynchronously or having recordings can increase accessibility for students who like can't make a particular workshop time, but they can still work on the recording aspect and participate in the group project or something, or students who have internet connection issues. I live in a rural area. There are areas that very close to me that have limitations to their internet access. So sometimes in terms of like internet speeds and quality, it can be awesome to record things and do things asynchronously for that reason. Other reasons too, right? Like I've said, just from one day to the next, sometimes have the student being able to get in the zone in their own way, in their own space, unobserved, deal with their wet socks, make sure they're not hungry, make sure they're maybe not as tired that day. But I mean, like approach it at a time and place that is very supportive to them. And that's great. The flip side of it, and why I often don't like demand recordings, is that homework like that for particularly like young students is really often dependent on like adult support in their life and the schedule they have, even for older students, right? So sometimes it can be great for students to have a chance to take that away and work on it, but sometimes it's a lot of pressure to be like on the parents to be like, you need to make a recording for your kid, which sometimes just even making the house quiet enough for that could be a really stressful thing. Getting the tech set up can, be really freaky for some people. And so I love the ways it can work. I also often don't like kind of demand it. I create options and I suggest it to students, but I don't say, okay, everyone has to go record, because I'm very aware that for some families that could be a huge ask, even though it seems accessible. And for other families, it might be easy and it might be something that's awesome to explore. But I try to be really mindful of that sort of thing, because I want the time that students are with me and and that they're making music to work for them and to be positive, and that even if they can't do like extended recording projects the rest of the time, I don't want them to be shut out of experiences because of that.
That's true. Yeah, some of those type of things, recording and collaborating, it's for students up that are a little more independent and tech savvy, then it can work really well as a tool. But yeah, same idea for my virtual recitals. Just do a couple of those a year, because for some families it is a more involved process.
Yeah, and I've been considering doing a virtual recital myself. I've done in-person recitals, and recording during the lesson is also like can be part of that, so that it's not necessarily something the family has to take on separately.
Yeah, absolutely. I've done that on the online lesson, and then my kid did a virtual recital on flute, and it was a virtual recital, but she was doing in-person and outdoor lessons. But her flute teacher set up a bunch of decorations like it was outside in her front yard and actually filmed it herself and put it together in a playlist. So they came up and played, but the teacher took care of all the production. And then it made for more of a uniform experience too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think like the whole, again, it could be a whole episode on virtual recitals, then virtual forms of sharing. And I think there are a lot of interesting and promising formats which are outside of the question that was asked, but whether it's put together all in one piece, right? Or I've heard of teachers breaking it up so that it's kind of a watch party of individual videos.
Yeah.
I've been interested in using, I've seen virtual spaces like GatherTown used for sharing. And
Sam Reddy said I don't know how he pronounces his last name, but founder of Musi, he's doing his first online class totally in VR, testing that out. So that could be quite a recital on the moon or something. When you do the VR recitals, they'll be good. Well, yeah, thanks James and Melissa for those questions. And yeah, we'd love to hear from more of you folks. You can submit them through infiniteimprovisation.com or find us online. And okay, well, I mean, that's wrapping up our pilot season of our first 5 episodes to see, okay, how's this? Check in how we did our 5 episodes. How's it feeling?
It's feeling good. I'm happy to be along to be along with you on this adventure, to be on this adventure. I'm happy that folks are listening to this adventure and asking questions, and I'm excited for what's to come.
Yeah, likewise. And we didn't run out of things to talk about, so.
A promising start.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. See you next time.